I'm Heather Stewart, I'm the economics editor of The Guardian, and this session is about a really sort of interesting topic where the government is actually trying to take research, social research that's been done, and turn it into policy. There's a lot of interest in this area, I think, and it's about how to create social connections between people in different income groups. How do you do that? Why does it matter? What are the potential benefits of that? So it's nice and practical, hopefully. We've got a really good panel. We've got Professor David Halpern, who glories in the title of President Emeritus at the Behavioural Insights team, which is a journalist I have to call the Nudge Unit, sorry. Bolly Curtis is the CEO of Demos, and Dr. Antonio Silva, who's going to talk to us first, is Head of Social Cohesion at the Behavioural Insights team, and he's going to talk to us about some research he's done using metadata that really sort of shed some interesting light on these connections between people in different income groups, different classes, if you like, and what impact that has throughout their life. So we'll start hearing about that research, and then we'll hear from the panel, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. So do you want to start, Antonio?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So we often talk about economic capital, what you have, and human capital, what you know. But there's a third ingredient that is just as powerful, which is social capital, who you know and how well your community is connected. Think about the last time you found a job, got advice about university, or even stayed out of trouble as a teenager. Often isn't just what you know, but who you know. And this is what social capital is. And social capital comes in two flavors. You got bonding capital, which are the strong ties within close-knit groups, like family or close friends. And it provides support and a sense of belonging. And then you have bridging capital, which are the weaker ties that connect people across different groups. It can open doors to new opportunities and experiences. And both matter, but today, as we'll see, bridging capital is particularly important for social mobility. And social capital, in general, unlike money or skills, it's often hidden, or at least harder to measure, which then leads to sometimes being overlooked. And we hope that this study gives a way to see it at scale and the role it can have in policymaking and particularly in social mobility. And so we analyzed 6 billion friendships from about 58% of the UK population using Facebook social network data. This unique data set allowed us to understand social networks and relationships in a way that previously was just not possible. We looked at a lot of factors from using this data, such as rates of volunteering, activism, intergenerational connections, intercultural connectedness. But out of all the factors that we looked at, two important ones emerged. Economic connectedness. So this is the share of high-income friends that low-income individuals have. And long ties, which are the share of friends that you have that you don't share any other friends with. So, for example, I'm friends with Sarah, but Sarah is not friends with any of my other friends. She's a long tie. So in order to preserve anonymity, we aggregated this individual metrics into neighborhood-level metrics and explored whether these were associated with social mobility in those neighborhoods. We looked at social mobility by using the LEO dataset, which we looked at the number of children in receipt of free school meals in an area at age 16, and then the average earnings of those children at age 28, and that's how we measured social mobility. And then finally, we also looked at how social capital metrics that we had correlated with other well-being metrics, so like trust and life satisfaction, which you collected directly from Facebook users. And so on to what we found. We found perhaps surprisingly that friendships in the UK actually tend to bridge economic divides. When you look at people on the bottom half of the income ladder, nearly half of their friendships come from the top half. For comparison, using similar data from the US, we find that number to be 39% rather than 47%, so quite a big difference. And even when you look at the extreme ends, so when we look at the poorest 10%, we find that they still have 5% of their friendships coming from the richest top 10%. However, cross-income friendships are unequally distributed across the country, with economic connectedness being highest in the affluent south, while lowest in the Scottish Central Belt and Northern Ireland. And we find that economic connectedness matters. So disadvantaged children growing up in areas that are more economically connected have a better chance of having a higher salary, 38% higher salary annually later in life. To give you, this equates roughly to about £5,000 extra every year by moving from a low economic connected neighborhood to a high economic connected area. It's not just being friends with people who are wealthier than you that helps you get ahead in life. We also find that having friends with you who don't have any shared friends, the long ties that I mentioned, is also strongly associated with social mobility. And the impact of this long ties appears to be mediated by actually only a handful of friends. So people on average have less than 10 of these bridging friends. And for example, going from 5 to 6 of these friends, for example, can increase your future earnings by about 8%. And long ties really matter. Even when taking into account other factors, we find that the share of long ties is the single most important factor in explaining social mobility at an area level, even beyond average income, education, or health. And so while social mobility matters, we also know that how much you earn isn't the only thing that matters, obviously, and how we feel about ourselves, whether we trust our neighbors or not, whether we feel like we can ask them for help, are also crucial aspects of our lives. And so we looked at how economic connectedness and long ties relate to these issues. And here the picture is more mixed. While for low-income people, having more high-income friends is associated with greater life satisfaction, greater general trust, more likely to feel connected to others and a sense of support, conversely, having more low-income friends has the opposite impact. And so we can see how the proportion or number of low SES friends is associated with reduced well-being, which seems to suggest that great economic connectedness comes with costs, particularly for higher income individuals. When we look at bridging capital, specifically long ties, we also find that despite helping you get ahead in life and helping your social mobility, it also comes with costs. And so people with more bridging friends have lower life satisfaction, more likely to feel disconnected, less likely to trust others, and also less likely to feel socially supported. So these findings show us the complex nature of bridging capital, that while getting out of a social circle, it's critical to help you do well in life. It can also be unpleasant. And most of you probably recognize this uncomfortable experience to some extent, whether it's meeting new people that you've never met before when you start a new job or when you go to university. And it seems that when you look at people who are more likely to cross social groups, similar things happen. So we have this very interesting results, but the key question is the so what question. What do we do about this? And if we know that your friendships are important to our lives, where do we actually make these friendships is an important step to understand how we may be able to frame it differently. And so what we find is that the large majority of friendships are made either in the area where you live, kind of your neighborhood, which are the first two bars, or in your school, which are the second set of bars in the graph. And so in comparison with other settings like workplaces, university, or churches, they don't appear to be where we make most of our friends. And so when thinking about policy implications, we think it makes sense to start or to focus on neighborhoods and schools. And so we will discuss this in more detail in the panel, what can be done to help people meet people outside of their social group. But here are some of our initial ideas where we think policy initiatives, both centrally and at local level, can help boost bridging capital. So schools shape where we meet, yet economic segregation is rising in these settings. Things like admissions reform, for example, increasing the radius of catchment areas, or lotteries can open doors to greater social inclusion. Some schools already do this, but a more systematic approach is likely needed. At the same time, Ofsted could start assessing levels of social mixing in schools. And so, as a lot of our social circle is developed the school, classrooms and playgrounds should be designed to maximize opportunities to connect across divides. The National Citizenship Service show that civic programs really do boost social connections. And in the UK, this is one of the most well-evidenced programs to achieve this connection across divides. And so we think a redesigned National Citizenship Service, which could include things like automatic registration, where people have to opt out instead of opt in, which would increase the reach, and also to be more locally engaged, could be an important lever in increasing exposure to different groups and different types of people at scale. We also know that communities thrive when they control their own resources. The Community Ownership Fund helped this happen when it existed. And when we visited during our ethnographic exploration, when we visited well-connected neighborhoods, we'd often find that this fund and this related policies really had helped communities. For example, to get together and be able to buy the local pub and prevent them from closing down. And this was something that we've encountered on multiple occasions. One way to improve a potential new fund would be to simplify the process and reduce the required bureaucracy to access those funds, which limits, in the end, who can access this type of support. Sports are another great way of increasing social mixing, as sports is one of the activities that has got the greatest appeal across class divides in this country. The way municipal sports facilities operate could be tweaked to promote this, for example. People could be able to join football teams that were automatically created to include individuals from different groups and offer lower prices as an incentive to join these teams. We piloted a similar approach to promote ethnic mixing in children's summer camps quite successfully, and a similar approach could be implemented in this context. And then finally, during our ethnographic work, we found that volunteers were absolutely essential to run a lot of the social infrastructure where people can meet, so libraries, community centers, or churches. And in places without volunteers, we'd often go to this community centers or libraries, and they were often closed. So the social infrastructure existed, but simply wasn't open in most days. And so we know that there are several organizations that promote and aggregate volunteering opportunities in your local area, but we found that people are often not aware of these. And also in some neighborhoods, volunteering just simply isn't something you do. It's not normalized like it is in other neighborhoods, and this makes a crucial difference in how the social infrastructure runs. And so something akin to the big society might be useful here, perhaps with a fresh rebrand and perhaps not associated with austerity, but we think a different framing and access to volunteering could make a really big difference. And so I'll end here, and before I'd like to thank our funder, Nesta Foundation, and our partners, the RSA, Opportunity Insights, Neighbourly Lab, Meta, and Stripe Partners. And now on to the panel, where we'll discuss the best ways to bring social capital to the forefront of policy making. So, thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Antonio. There's lots to digest there, including both data and some quite concrete examples of how to build social capital. So let's hear from the panel, because there's quite, as I said, there's quite a lot going on in this area at the moment. I think quite a lot of thinking and even some money. So let's hear, what do you make of the research and what it tells us and how we put it into effect. Shall we start with you, Polly Curtis?
Yeah, it's fantastic research, and I love your recommendations as well. And I love the theme of optimism kind of running through this conference. we had a discussion at work the other day about whether optimism was actually hope fascism at the moment, that you have to offer some hope because things are so bleak. But I think on this subject, you really can offer some hope, but it's worth kind of talking about the risks in this area as well. Because at the moment, there are bonds building in this country, and there are coalitions forming and movements building, and they're not all for progressive, hopeful reasons. And I think we have to be kind of really clear-eyed that actually what is happening in parts of the movements building across this country, when you see people taking action in the street, putting flags up in the street, that is people finding connection and hope. Depending on what your politics is, you might find that threatening and alarming. And certainly when I look at my local WhatsApp group, it's very divisive. But that's why I think the focus in this research on the bridging capital is so vital, because we all need to get out of our bubbles and connect with people to create a more hopeful future. I was asked to kind of talk about specific practical things that can be done, and building on some of the recommendations here as well. I just wanted to make a few kind of key points. Place really matters, having places that people come together across divides. They're also quite expensive solutions, and so it's great to see the government putting money into family hubs again. That was proven over time, incredibly important. And finding those points where people's lives naturally meet through having babies or playing a sport or being teenagers, building on what's already there. I'm also interested in your recommendations. There's a theme there which is about social capacity as well as social infrastructure. So not just kind of place, but the time to invest in community building, because we all know those people in our communities who are natural kind of asset builders in kind of community capital and can make those connections. And actually in so many spaces, actually a more effective kind of contribution is building more capacity to allow more capacity to be built. So giving people time through volunteering or through the school system where there is already resource, giving people time to build the connections in communities. I wanted to pick up as well on the citizenship education point, because that feels really critical. I spent some time in Sheffield schools recently doing workshops on social media and politics and what young people who will be voting at the next election feel about things. And it was really interesting running those focus groups, because the young people and the schools really loved it. But there were conversations that weren't being had in schools about politics. And when we talked to the teachers afterwards, it's because they are so scared of holding those conversations, because they inevitably get onto Israel, Palestine, or trans issues. These really difficult subjects for teachers to navigate, and they're too scared to do it. Schools aren't equipped to do that. So in the citizenship space, I think enabling schools to hold those really difficult conversations and building capacity to be able to have those conversations, that's where those conversations can flourish. Because what I saw was people talking past each other. There's two groups of kids in these focus groups, not listening, not engaging, and shouting kind of in separate streams. And within citizenship as well, it's not just about learning about systems, it's learning how to develop citizenship habits of engaging in these subjects, talking about them, being part of your community and crossing those divides. The last thing I wanted to kind of say is, two more points. One is just on the digital solutions on this, because it's brilliant this work came out of Facebook. There are great connections that can be made through digital. There are also huge risks there as well about creating niches and silos and spaces where like-minded people weaponize against other people as well. In Taiwan, there's some brilliant work that's been done on bridging algorithms and actually changing the way algorithms connect people through social to bridge divides and bring people together rather than separate them out. And there's some very kind of technical solutions in there that I think we should all be looking at as well. Just a final point around the politics of this. It was really interesting hearing Wes Streeting talking about the roles and responsibilities of citizens to be part of the solution, and how squeamish politicians are about getting involved in these things. I don't want a politician to tell me how to have a friendship. But I was talking to an MP the other day who gave a really good example of actually where I think we also need leadership on some of these issues. She had a primary school in her constituency where primary age kids were on a WhatsApp group sharing inappropriate pictures. And a group of parents came to her and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And she just looked at them and went, "What are you going to do about it?" in her head, because she was too scared to say that to the families. Like, she didn't feel like she could throw it. She had to help them in some way. She couldn't say to them, "This is on you. Why are your kids in WhatsApp groups?" And I think there is a conversation to be had there about how politicians are more explicit about the roles of citizens. And because I think what those families wanted was leadership. They were actually inviting politicians into the private space to be part of the solution. So I think there's a kind of roles and responsibilities point in there. That's it.
Really interesting. Lots of food for thought. David?
Yeah, but I wonder if we should just dive into money. What are the benefits?
Go for it.
Because in case you were wondering if you were in the right session, what are the benefits with the friends with benefits in this particular case? And we sort of take it for granted, but one of the things that's so striking about social capital in general and our networks is that they are so important to us in our lives and what happens in society, and yet we underplay them. We don't think, well, how would you nurture them in the policy world? So obviously the social and emotional, like if you need to borrow some money, you need some help, who's going to turn to, right? It's really consequential. You don't turn first and foremost normally to a state actor. You might do, but it's normally through your networks. It's incredibly consequential. We know for your health. We just had, Wes talking about it. We're very familiar now talking about obesity and smoking and so on, and yet the effect sizes which we see for your social network are at least as large or comparable. A famous stat, 15 cigarettes a day is actually slightly less bad than being socially isolated. So if you are going to smoke, at least do it with your friends. The crime effects are very, very large. One of the really neat things in the Neighbourhood Commission, we went back to look at the areas that had these quite small sums of money from local trust, £1 million quid or whatever. And then if you put match controls, and remember they could do all their own things, do you see any effects? It's a difference in difference model. We do one of the biggest areas you see it on crime, actually, these areas. So these tiny bits of extra resource to support their social capital and social assets see significantly larger reductions in crime over time. But also growth. You touched on it with respect to your economic opportunities. Operate at the individual level. It also operates as a network effect in terms of, your ability to operate in the world because you can go and talk to someone and they are not going to rip you off, right? The fact that you can have these trusted relationships. It is and as you'll know, Andy Haldane and I did this paper on earlier in the year around the impacts on economic growth, which are really massive, let alone for governance itself. So the effect sizes are enormous in almost every domain of policy in our lives. And then the curious thing is we see it all around us except in policy. It's like some weird, it's not in the Treasury models and so on. So the good news, well, what can we do about it? I think there's lots that we could do about it. Just to very briefly rehearse, and maybe you'll push further, but a bit like Wes was talking about on health, is make it easy, is what can you do with respect to make it easy to just form these relationships? And I think the everyday example of it, like, the sort of water cooler spaces, places, you don't have to have full Italian piazzas everywhere, but, if you've got benches, in Britain we've got benches and they're all like, it's very Anglo-Saxon, they're all like this, so that you don't have to talk to people on another bench, right? But you can, if you angle benches like this, it changes the dynamic, right? In the sense that it creates an opportunity if you want to be to social interact or not. And it's a kind of trivial matter, but like a New Deal in the US, one of the biggest things they did is they built huge numbers of benches in these little spaces across America. Anyway, so there's that. What are the things you can do to enable it? And there's lots of those things, including around schools, by the way. So once you got that, what are you doing to enable the social capital? Tom Steinberg years ago gave the example, which I love, which is, aren't school gates really important? If you hang around waiting for your kids, like, what can you do? That's where you want a coffee shop, like to hang around and actually be slightly more pleasant and talk to someone else. If we were serious about it and we thought about the spillover benefits, like, geez, of course we should do that. We're nuts not to create those kind of spaces. Secondly, there's a big issue. We're all here in a world, one of the classic questions and measures. Do you think, generally speaking, do you think other people can be trusted? We've asked that question for more than 50 years. If I ask it in the room today, would you say yes or no, can't be too careful? We can't play the game. How many people would say yes? Most people would go. Right, and how many would say no, can't be too careful? Well, almost no one. So this is because you are a weird, strange audience, which is what you see in policy community for years, right? It's really lovely and nice. Less than half the population in Britain would say yes to that question. It's very, so you live in a kind of Norwegian life of actually high social capital. Good for you, good for us, right? It is literally good for us. When you get out and do the neighbour commission, it's not true. Right? That is not what you see in many areas. So many people, low-income areas, they may see more of their neighbours, but they often, I'm afraid, will trust them less. They do not have this rich sort of, that is not their life experience. So there's specific things that we can do in respect to that around, I think, still relatively low-cost things. The last thing, to some extent, is if you look at structurally, you can substitute. That's what we do in society. So are there other ways that you create trust beyond networks or that reinforce it? Someone I've got very obsessed in recent years about what are called shrouding problems in the economy, which is, can I tell who's a good builder, that's also part of the same story. Can I trust someone else? So when we talk about trust, and you can put your hands up, it's also because in your experience, people are trustworthy, right? You are able to filter that out. Well, that's partly an informational issue. You want to design, have you designed a society and economy within which people who are trustworthy get, more and more impact, and people who are not, that behaviour is woven out. And you can actually design for it in respect to actually how you engineer your markets and your society more generally.
Antonio, I'd like to hear more about schools. Talking about reading, it sounds very straightforward, and it strikes me it would be extremely controversial because every time anyone looks at catchment areas in any way whatsoever, it causes huge issues. How do you make the argument to the public, this is really worth doing, there's a sort of benefit to doing this?
Yeah, so it is controversial. There will be quite a lot of barriers, but the fact is, the more we research, the more we found that actually a lot of schools, it's not that uncommon for this to already happen. Schools have quite a lot of freedom to do this. And for example, Mospon School in Hackney, that is near where I live, they do this on purpose to different radius. So we take X%, 1 kilometre, 3 kilometres, and 5 kilometres precisely to avoid people moving into an area just so they can go to that school, and this kind of automatically does this. Similarly, lotteries is another way of doing it, and you can combine the two. And so it doesn't have to be that controversial. It just needs to be something that the schools want to do, that other levers like Ofsted or DFE, they can also encourage this and mark this essentially, like is there social mixing happening in that school or not? And in terms of the benefits I think the economic benefit is a clear one. If we're trying to increase social mobility and help people do well in schools, an incredible engine for that. This is one aspect of it that doesn't cost anything. It's probably the cheapest way to increase social mobility that you can do. And so I think starting for that to be a consideration in the kind of educational sector, it would be a really important first step. And catchment areas are just one out of many possible things you can do. There's a lot of things you can do inside the school as well. But this is just one of them that's already.
I was going to say one thing really important. I know you didn't have very much time to go through it all, but many of you will know Raj Chetty's work in the US, which shows these astonishingly huge effects of networks and so on. But also one of the differences when you look at what Antonio and the team have been doing versus the US data is we are still pretty socially mixed. We live closely together with other, we haven't seen that polarization, and you see it literally in the network effects too. So the numbers are really quite different in the UK. So even if before you say, okay, we're going to complete lottery on your social networks into school, there's a lot of mixing sort of there, but it's not going deep. So one of the neat things in this work is you're trying to work out something called the broccoli of social capital, right? The super vegetable.
The broccoli.
The broccoli, yeah. So so there are certain kinds of activities, and hobbies seem to be one of those things where they bring together people from groups. And again, on the Neighbourhood Commission being out there, a classic example is small football pitches in the middle of communities. And a few volunteers look after them, right? So, because once you're running around, whatever, it doesn't matter if your mum or your dad is a solicitor or a painter or what, and then there's a kind of mixing on the touchline, etc. So it's just, how do you make it happen? And even in schools, one of the famous results is that when you get bigger schools, you actually get internal segregation occurs on social networks as well. So it's actually smaller schools, you don't have room to segregate in the same way. So that's giving you clues about this. Even within the sort of existing structure, there are things that we could do, I mean, collectively, to make it more likely that we will connect and bridge.
And this is about links across income groups, but is this also part of the recipe for dealing with absorbing quite large-scale immigration in the way that we've had, and forming more cohesive groups, or not dividing, or dealing with some of the issues that Polly was sort of gesturing at there? That is this part of the recipe for forming closer connections, whatever your background, whatever your...
It has been historically. There's another commission, there's several running at the moment, but one on community and cohesion, which is looking at some of those issues more broadly. And it took its first evidence session, and I would say it was a fantastic presentation. Somebody, a reasonably well-known figure, but who grew up in the East End or whatever, but was contrasting about how, you look back at his father's generation, whatever. If you're in East End, it was a melting pot for lots of reasons. As he rather elegantly put it, we all learn a bit of Yiddish and we smoke a bit of pot, and it's like you can see it happening. But then in contrast, what also happened in a lot of those periods, if you go back 2-3 generations, you get a lot of areas which are actually white only in other parts of the country, and actually they're the ones that are really most worried normally about immigration, and so where you don't see those populations. So it's not just the sort of contact hypothesis writ large, but it looks a lot like it, right?
Yeah.
It's not a real world example, but we're running a big program on deliberative policy making around immigration at the moment. And all the evidence shows that if you bring people with very broad opinions together in a safe space and a really powerful deliberative process, there is a natural moderation that happens in those processes, and people find kind of compromises and ways through. And it's what we talk about, kind of like a MIMBY majority kind of effect, that actually at the moment our kind of public debate is being so driven by the extremes. When you bring people together without those kind of like extreme drivers in the room, people find kind of ways through those very kind of seemingly toxic debates.
Interesting. Let's take some questions. Lady over there. Oh, a mic's heading your way. Brilliant.
Thank you so much. My name's Carmen. I work for Impact on Urban Health. And I've got an invitation and one question. An invitation really to visit one of the partners in Southwark that we work with, Surrey Square Primary School, where we actually, fund a huge project called the Old Kent Road Family Zone, and that really brings together the community in a whole school approach, and has a Saturday marketplace where there's just, we create the kind of infrastructure where people can form these bonds, connect with others. And so, that is very much an open invitation to the room. And the question I have is, Polly, you spoke about kind of those difficult conversations in schools, and I feel really passionately about us all learning better how to listen, how to engage with each other on difficult things. But how can we drive that without good role models, particularly at the top of politics, where I feel the culture has become ever increasingly divisive? I never see anyone anymore saying, I was wrong. I made a mistake.
Really interesting. And there's a lady behind, directly, in my eye line, there we go, sort of in a straight line behind, and then we'll just take two and then...
Hi, I'm Kelly Pereira, Head of Innovation Improvement Programs at the Health Foundation. I have a couple of questions about the data, actually. One piece is we're focusing on schools and obviously local areas, and that's often a point statistic. So actually, what are the good interventions for lifelong friendship building? That's the one thing, because I think a lot of people experience loneliness, as you go through life. The second thing is that it's quite interesting. How much do you think the immigration argument is different from the waves of people that have come before? Actually, we have a lot of a sense of these people are not from here, and then generations after generations, there's a lot of integration. So how is the phenomenon that we experience now significantly different from the past? And I'd be curious to say what the data says on that, or just, reflections. And then the third point is, as we go into our spaces of work, we see greater segregation in terms of economic standing. So how do we account for that too? So I definitely understand in secondary school settings where people have their friendships, but actually, as we've moved through the life course, what does
How
that
do you
look like?
sustain that mixing later on? Okay, gone quite deep there, haven't we? Paulie, do you want to take the one about sort of role models and difficult conversations and...
Yeah.
I mean, take whichever ones you like. But
it's
came off what you'd said, sort of thing.
It's a really interesting question about how we improve the quality of our national conversation as well, so that can trickle through. A lot of the work we do around that kind of deliberative, participatory kind of policy making process is aimed to improve the quality and depth of debate that informs policy. It can't always be kind of reflected back at a national scale, but I think there is a role for leadership in this. Very practically speaking, I think the way we tackle these issues through the curriculum is very fragmented, it's very different in different spaces. Actually, we really need to redefine the purpose of citizenship/media literacy/PHSE and think about what the purpose of that time in a school is, and how teachers can become better facilitators of conversations in those spaces rather than educators. It's a different role, I think, to help build that civic habit. Interestingly, I think we've got a really exciting moment to do that with the Votes at 16. That should be a national project and a national moment to really shift the way we think and talk about politics, starting young. So I think there's an opportunity there.
Antonio, so there was a question. There was a sort of is there a cohort effect? Has this changed over time? And also, what about relationships older in life, beyond the school gate or beyond that?
Yeah, so we didn't look specifically at kind of ethnic mixing or different. The one thing we could look at is language mixing. So people that use a different first language and whether they're friends with each other. And we found quite a lot of variation, but we did not find that per se to be associated with social mobility and other factors. And it's actually, there's an interesting aside that while we are here doing a big push for social capital, it's important to note that the majority of our metrics were not associated with social mobility. So things like intercultural or interlanguage connectedness, age connectedness, activism, and clustering many different metrics were not actually important. So it's actually the economic connectedness and the long ties are really the crucial ones. So it's important to be kind of specific about what type of social capital matter and maybe don't matter for social mobility at least. In terms of kind of later in life friendships, I've thought a lot about this and I don't have a good answer. We know that the rate of friendships decreases over time, and we probably can, if you think about when was the last time you made a friend, it's probably a while ago, and people in their 20s is much faster, is much easier. So yeah, I don't actually have kind of, it's a much harder ask, and that's why it's so important to, when you're young, to really promote this mixing, because you're just more open to friendships. And one thing is when you're open to friendships, then design a setting that facilitates their mixing, versus later in life when you're already less open. So it's possible, but it's much harder.
Yeah, I have a personal anecdote about that, which is that my dad's had to move to a different part of the country to be near me. My mum's gone into a care home. He went to a cooking course. Age UK ran it, cost a £5 a week or whatever, has made a new friend who's recently widowed, and they're off on holiday together. And it's just like, I don't know how much that cost, that intervention, but it won't have been very much. And it just opens up little connections. We haven't got very long. We could take very quickly, but it's like, you can't have three, you can have one quick question. Lady in the front, and then lady with the glasses behind. Oh, sorry, all questions from women. Sorry, that wasn't deliberate.
Hi, Jane Ellison. Super quick observation around the school catchments. I mean, it could be very tricky. But one of the things practically is, certainly in London, in a previous life, I experienced housing associations often being very drawn towards selling off properties in high property value areas in order to be able to build a lot more units somewhere else. But actually, I saw the value of housing association properties really creating more social mix. So I think it's just worth thinking about that. It's very logical from their point of view, but it actually diminishes, particularly in an area like London, the mix in a catchment area. And I saw the benefit. My question was really, I was really surprised about the university data that you showed on that. And I just wondered if something had changed about the way people are going to university, because I think about my generation, nearly all the people I know made their best friends through university, and actually there's quite a big social mix.
That's a good question. I'm going to get shouted at for running over, but it's a good question. Lady right behind.
Hi, Isla, Department for Work and Pensions. I find it really interesting. It makes sense about like the schools being a place where the connections can be bridged. I was just wondering, from like my personal experience where I grew up, there's still a divide with like the parents, and like parents not wanting like friends to be in certain groups. Like I know my parents didn't want me to make friends with,
not all parents want social mixing, right?
They didn't want to have the kids in big houses come and visit our house and be embarrassed about it. So I just wondered if there was any mitigations about like the parental thoughts around these children making friendships.
Interesting, right. Let's try and do those really knotty questions quickly. University, Antonio.
The universities, I was also surprised by the data. I think it's part to do that. Actually, the majority of people don't go to university, particularly if you look, now it's about 40-50%, but if this is the entire population, the share of people is actually much smaller, and that's why everyone does go to schools, end up being more important. But I was also surprised by the lower number despite that. In terms of like parents and other people not liking to do social mixing, our data does support that. It's, people that do more social mixing don't seem to be as happy as people that do, and that's like one of the kind of difficult stories.
But it's not easy, like sometimes,
it's not easy.
I guess, yeah.
We tendentially prefer to interact with people that are similar to us, and so using the analogy of the broccoli is kind of, we don't need to find the broccoli, we need to find out how to make the broccoli tasty. How do we cook the broccoli that people
that's an age-old problem.
Because this needs to be fun. So social mixing needs to be done in a way that's not forced and needs to be enjoyable, because our natural tendency is not to do it.
Polly, do you have burning thoughts, or shall we draw it to a close with the broccoli?
Just a study I read recently where people were invited into a train. You could sit in the chatty carriage or the non-chatty carriage, and everyone went the non-chatty carriage, and the people who went in the chatty carriage came out feeling brilliant. So we need to make the case for it, and that it's worth the effort to engage with other people.
Brilliant. Eat your broccoli and sit in the chatty carriage. I think we've all learned a few things there. Thanks ever so much. And if we could thank the panel.